Jane Louise Mixer, a 23-year-old law student at the University of Michigan, mysteriously disappeared after seeking a ride through a college bulletin board. Her intention was to return to her hometown in Muskegon and share the exciting news of her engagement and plans to relocate to New York City with her loved ones. Tragically, the following day, her lifeless body, dressed in her raincoat and accompanied by a copy of the novel Catch-22, was discovered on a grave in Denton Cemetery, located in Van Buren Township. She had suffered 2 fatal gunshot wounds to the head. The authorities promptly initiated an investigation, yet it would take several decades to unravel the truth behind Jane's harrowing fate. The township of Van Buren, situated in Wayne County, Michigan, is a charter township strategically positioned between the Detroit Metropolitan and Willow Run airports. This advantageous location renders it an appealing destination for both business enterprises and residential living. Noteworthy establishments such as USA Jet Airlines, headquartered at Willow Run Airport, contribute to the township's economic prosperity. Furthermore, Van Buren Township serves as the home base for Visteon, an automotive parts manufacturer. As per the 2020 census, the township's population amounted to 30,375 residents. However, it is imperative to acknowledge the crime statistics within the city. The likelihood of falling victim to any form of crime in Van Buren Township is 1 in 23. It was within this community that the tragic tale of Jane Louise Mixer unfolded. Born on February 23, 1946, in Muskegon, Michigan, Jane grew up alongside her older sister, Barbara, under the care of their parents, Dan and Marion Mixer. Jane was remembered by those who knew her as a thoughtful and serious individual who never hesitated to voice her opinions. She was known for her intelligence and independence, always forging her own path. Maggie Nelson, Jane's niece, expressed her admiration for her aunt, describing her as someone she aspired to be: ambitious, rebellious, brilliant, and self-reliant. Driven by her desire to make a difference, Jane enrolled at the University of Michigan in the 1960s after completing high school. Her college education was just one step in her journey to impact the world. In 1969, Jane, at the age of 23, was filled with hope and determination. She was among the few women at law school, standing out among 420 students, and was deeply involved in political activism and civil rights advocacy. She was carving her own way forward. Additionally, she had recently become engaged to Phil Weitzman, an economics professor who shared her passion for social change. Despite dating for over a year, Jane faced opposition from her parents regarding her relationship with Phil. Her father's disapproval stemmed from Phil's Jewish faith and liberal beliefs, which he believed influenced Jane's participation in campus protests. To complicate matters further, Phil had secured a job at New York University, necessitating a move from Michigan to New York. Jane intended to break the news gently to her parents before Phil joined her for a spring break visit to their hometown of Muskegon. However, what was meant to be a joyous occasion marking Jane's engagement turned tragic. During that time, hitchhiking was a common practice driven by trust and a desire for freedom. While Jane exercised caution and did not accept rides from strangers, she utilized a popular ride board system at the university. This system consisted of a large map covered in plastic located in the student union basement, with wooden boxes categorized by destinations resembling a library card catalog. Jane wrote her contact information on a slip of paper and placed it in the Muskegon box. If another student had plans to go to the same place, they would contact each other and arrange to share a ride. In this case, a student named David Johnson called Jane to confirm their ride-sharing arrangement. On the evening of March 20th, 1969, Jane was in her dorm room at the Law Quadrangle with her fiancé, Phil. It was a cool spring evening, and spring had just officially begun the day before. After spending some time together, Phil left for a tutoring session, and Jane decided to call David Johnson at 6:30 p.m. to coordinate their ride. Jane had already packed her suitcase and had a gift for her mother. She left her dorm, not knowing that it would be the last time she would be seen alive. As the clock passed 10 p.m., Jane's father in Muskegon started to worry. She had promised to be home by 9:30 p.m. after finding a ride back. By 11 p.m., her father's worry turned into panic. He got in his car and searched the highway in Ann Arbor throughout the night, but he couldn't find any trace of Jane. At midnight, he called Phil, Jane's fiancé, who hadn't seen the driver but assumed everything was fine since Jane hadn't answered his call at 7 p.m. Dan's hope began to fade. By 4 a.m., Jane was still missing. Phil, now deeply concerned, went to her dorm room. It was still dark as he drove by. At 8 a.m., Dan informed Phil that he had reported Jane missing to the police. Phil managed to get a key to Jane's room and searched it, but he didn't find anything unusual. Little did they know at that time, Jane's journey had come to a chilling end much earlier than anyone could have imagined. Instead of heading west towards Muskegon, her intended destination 172 miles away, she had somehow ended up traveling just 14 miles east in the opposite direction. On the morning of Friday, March 21st, 1969, in Van Buren Township, about 14 miles from the University of Michigan, Nancy Grow, a housewife, was awakened by her 13-year-old son, who was running late for the school bus. While rushing to prepare her son, Nancy's attention was diverted when he pointed out a department store bag he had discovered outside. Intrigued, Nancy opened the bag to find a peculiar assortment of items, a gift-wrapped package with a card, law school papers and folders, and fuzzy purple slippers. The contents left Nancy puzzled. Whose belongings were these? She had no clue. Unbeknownst to Nancy, she was about to uncover a tragic truth. The abandoned bag and its mysterious contents filled her with an unsettling feeling, causing her to worry about her son walking to the bus alone. Consequently, she made the decision to personally drive him to school. As they passed Denton Cemetery, something caught Nancy's eye near the entrance, a flash of yellow. As she approached, her blood ran cold. A lifeless body lay sprawled near a headstone, partially concealed. Panic surged through her, and she steered the car towards her sister's house, trembling. Upon arrival, she immediately contacted the police to report her shocking discovery. At approximately 10:30 a.m., the Ypsilanti police, led by retired Detective Donald Bennett, arrived at Denton Cemetery, located at the end of a gravel road. There, they uncovered the lifeless body of Jane Mixer just inside the chain-link fence surrounding the cemetery. Her remains were covered with a raincoat and her personal belongings, including a suitcase, a paperback copy of Catch-22, and various clothing items on hangers were scattered around her body. Jane's posture was striking, with one arm resting above her head and the other shielding her eyes. The evident gunshot wounds on her head revealed the cause of her demise. However, the absence of blood and any signs of dragging indicated that the murder did not take place at the cemetery. Furthermore, a stocking had been tightly wrapped around her throat. Clad in a blue-gray jumper, her undergarments were partially pulled down. The only evidence left behind by the perpetrator were fresh tire tracks and the imprint of a man's shoe heel. These provided limited leads for the investigators at the crime scene. According to the findings of the Washtenaw County Medical Examiner, Robert Hendricks, Jane's cause of death was determined to be 2 gunshot wounds to her head. The initial shot struck her left temple, followed by another to the lower left part of her skull. Additionally, she had been strangled with a stocking of cinnamon color. Although the evidence suggested that the strangulation occurred after her death, the fact that Jane was partially undressed raised suspicions of potential sexual assault. Based on the medical examination, it was estimated that she was shot with a .22 caliber firearm sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. This time frame indicated that she had been held captive elsewhere for over 4 hours, assuming she was likely abducted around 6:30 p.m. The presence of soap granules on her coat led investigators to speculate whether she had been confined in a laundry area during her captivity. The news of Jane's death reached her parents swiftly, and they were faced with the heartbreaking task of identifying her body at the morgue in Ann Arbor. Unfortunately, word of the tragedy had also spread to the media, resulting in a swarm of reporters at the morgue entrance. As the police escorted Jane's parents away, they were bombarded with questions from the reporters. Following an officer's advice, they refrained from answering. "They promised to keep the reporters away from us," Dan Mixer said. "It was such a tragic situation. It felt like a deeply personal invasion of our privacy." Upon the discovery of Jane's body, the police initiated an immediate investigation into her murder. They quickly became aware of her planned rideshare with David Johnson. While conducting a search of Jane's room and the campus for clues, they stumbled upon two significant leads regarding the identity of the mystery driver. A checkmark next to the name David Johnson in a phone book on Jane's dorm room desk suggested a potential connection. Additionally, in the basement of the law school library, they found another phone book with the words Mixer and Muskegon written in the margins. Acting on this information, the police paid a visit to the fraternity where University of Michigan student David Johnson resided. Despite David not being home, they questioned other residents and discovered that he was involved in a play on the night of Jane's disappearance. When they eventually spoke with David, he vehemently denied offering Jane a ride. After confirming David Johnson's alibi, the police ruled him out as a suspect in Jane's murder. Subsequently, investigators conducted a thorough search for every individual named David Johnson in Ann Arbor and its vicinity, particularly focusing on those who owned .22 caliber firearms. However, after an extensive investigation, all of these individuals were cleared of any involvement. Due to negative comments about Phil from Jane's father, the police turned their attention to Jane's fiancé. Despite facing intense questioning, Phil provided a solid alibi that led to his exoneration from suspicion in Jane's murder case. As the police delved deeper into Jane Mixer's murder, more killings occurred in the area, leaving them puzzled and alarmed as the case seemed to follow a troubling trend. Jane Mixer became the third young woman to be found dead in the area within the last 2 years. By the end of July, the number of victims had risen to 7, most of whom had suffered violent treatment before their deaths. As the bodies continued to accumulate, the Mixer family retreated from the public eye, but the community demanded action as the killer appeared to be unstoppable in 1969. The breakthrough in the case didn't occur until the 7th victim was discovered, leading to a surprising arrest. On July 31, 1969, 30-year-old John Norman Collins, an education major at Eastern Michigan University with no prior criminal record, was taken into custody for the murder of Karen Sue Baineman. A witness came forward, stating that they had seen Collins with Karen shortly before her death. While many believed Collins to be responsible for all 7 murders, he was only tried and convicted for Baineman's murder. Despite maintaining his innocence, Collins received a life sentence on August 19, 1970. He was never formally accused of the other 6 killings. Nonetheless, the people of Michigan felt a sense of relief, knowing that the perpetrator had been apprehended and the string of murders had come to an end. However, doubts lingered among investigators regarding Collins's involvement in Jane Mixer's case, as it didn't fit the established patterns of the other killings. The case remained unsolved for over 30 years until cold case detective Eric Schroeder decided to re-examine the evidence in 2001. Among the items found in the evidence box were a blood-stained yellow and white striped towel used to wrap around Jane's head after she was shot, as well as pantyhose and other potential sources of DNA evidence. Although DNA analysis wasn't utilized in criminal convictions until 1986, it had become a crucial tool in trials by the time Schroeder reopened the cold case. The evidence was sent to the State Crime Lab in Lansing, Michigan, where DNA analyst Steve Milligan began his examination. Milligan initiated his investigation by examining the items under a black light. He observed 4 visible spots on Jane's pantyhose that had the potential to contain DNA. Although these spots were not blood or semen stains, they could have been sweat left by the killer when he moved Jane's body to the light source in the graveyard. After isolating the stains, Milligan determined that 3 of them originated from the same male donor. Furthermore, he analyzed a single blood spot discovered on Jane's hand at the crime scene and identified a second male donor. However, when Milligan compared these DNA samples to John Norman Collins, the suspected killer, they did not match. Consequently, the analyst entered the DNA into CODIS, the combined DNA index system. Surprisingly, the blood spot produced a match, leading to the identification of a new suspect, John Rules, a convicted murderer serving time for killing his mother. Although this discovery would typically be a cause for celebration among cold case detectives, a major obstacle emerged. John Rules was only 4 years old in 1969 when Jane was killed, and he resided in Detroit, approximately 40 miles away from the crime scene. Despite these glaring inconsistencies, Schroeder proceeded to Bellamy Creek Prison in Michigan to speak with Rules. During their conversation, Schroeder learned that Rules had a troubled upbringing. His transient mother often left him alone and occasionally resorted to sedating him with cough syrup. Rules recounted a childhood memory where he claimed to have stumbled upon a gruesome scene involving 2 of his uncles in the garage. He vividly remembered seeing a blood-covered body in the back seat of a running car. Efforts were made to locate one of these uncles, who was alive, but his DNA did not match any of the DNA found at Jane's crime scene. In the early 2000s, not only the police, but also Maggie Nelson, the daughter of Barbara Nelson, Jane's sister, was focused on the murder of Jane Mixer as she was in the process of writing a book. The book presented a unique combination of poetry, memoir, and true crime, all revolving around the aunt she had never met. Although Jane had passed away before Maggie's birth, her tragic death had a profound impact on Maggie, shaping her life in various ways. In 2004, just as Maggie was preparing to release her memoir, Jane, a Murder, she received an unexpected call from Detective Schroeder, who informed her that progress was being made in the case. Maggie and her family were taken aback by this news. Despite knowing that the case had never been officially closed, they had resigned themselves to the belief that it would remain unsolved. A year after Detective Schroeder's interview with John Rules, he received another call from the state crime lab. The DNA found on Jane's pantyhose had yielded a match. It belonged to a 62-year-old man named Gary Leiterman from Gobles, Michigan. Leiterman, a retired nurse who was married with 2 children, seemed like an unlikely suspect. Schroeder spent over 2 months investigating Leiterman's background. He discovered that at the time of Jane's death, Leiterman was a 26-year-old man living approximately 20 miles from Arbor. He was unmarried and had served 4 years in the Navy. Although Leiterman did not have a criminal record for violent offenses, he had been arrested in 2001 for forging fake prescriptions. This incident stemmed from his struggle with addiction to painkillers after experiencing kidney stones. As part of his legal proceedings, he was required to undergo a treatment program, during which his DNA was entered into the combined DNA index system. In 2004, Schroeder brought Gary Leiterman in for questioning. 3 hours into the interrogation, Schroeder revealed the bombshell. He informed Leiterman that his DNA had been found on the body of murder victim Jane Mixer. Despite the incriminating evidence, Leiterman maintained his innocence, stating that he had not only not murdered Jane Mixer, but had never even met her. Schroeder observed undeniable evidence of Leiterman's involvement when he discovered Leiterman's DNA on Jane's pantyhose. Just before Thanksgiving in 2004, Leiterman was apprehended and held in custody without the possibility of bail. During the search of Leiterman's residence, detectives made a troubling discovery. They stumbled upon a hidden Polaroid photo in a bedside cabinet depicting an unconscious teenage girl partially undressed and lying on Leiterman's bed. Further investigation revealed that the girl was a 16-year-old South Korean exchange student who had been residing with the Leitermans. In a tearful testimony later on, the girl admitted to having no recollection of the photo being taken. Leiterman claimed that he had merely come across the photo and placed it in the cabinet to discuss with his wife upon her return from a trip. He described the exchange student as unruly and believed that he and his wife needed to address the situation regarding the photograph. Additionally, detectives uncovered an unmarked vial containing a powdered mixture of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, and diazepam, the active ingredient in Valium, inside Leiterman's shaving kit. A toxicologist referred to this combination as a knockout potion. In January 2005, a hearing was conducted to present the state's case against Gary Leiterman. Maggie Nelson, accompanied by her mother Barbara and her grandfather Dan Mixer, attended the proceedings. Maggie recalled her grandfather being the first witness to testify. Throughout the hearing, other evidence was introduced, including testimony from a female co-worker of Leiterman's, who had accused him of inappropriate behavior on a bus during a work trip. Additionally, a man who had lived with Leiterman in the late 60s provided testimony. He recounted how Leiterman had once shown him a vial of liquid and boasted that it could render a woman unconscious, and an excessive amount could even be fatal. However, much of his testimony was later deemed inadmissible during the trial. In July of 2005, Gary Leiterman faced trial for the murder of Jane Mixer in 1969. The prosecution, led by Steve Hiller, presented a case that outlined Leiterman's actions. Leiterman, using the alias David Johnson, responded to Jane's ride request at the University of Michigan. He picked her up in front of her dorm around 6:30 p.m. on March 20th, 1969, drove her to an unknown location, and held her there, potentially at gunpoint. It is suspected that he tried to assault Jane, leading to her resistance. In response, he shot her twice in the head, strangled her, and then disposed of her body in Denton Cemetery after midnight on March 21st, 1969. The primary evidence linking Leiterman to Jane was DNA found on the pantyhose. Additional evidence included a phone book discovered at the University of Michigan building during Jane's murder, containing the handwritten words Mixer and Muskegon. Handwriting expert Thomas Riley compared these words to samples from Leiterman and concluded that he likely wrote them. During the trial, a former roommate testified that Leiterman had a newspaper covering the story of John Norman Collins, suspected of murdering women in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. The roommate also mentioned Leiterman's ownership of a .22 revolver and a basement firing range. State records confirmed Leiterman's purchase of a .22 caliber Ruger revolver in 1967, which he reported stolen in 1987. Despite the reported theft, police found a revolver cylinder consistent with a Ruger Single 6.22 revolver cylinder. In the courtroom, an expert in ballistics from the state police testified that the bullet fragments found in Jane's body during her autopsy were similar to those discovered in Leiterman's residence in Van Buren County back in 2004. The expert further stated that there were more than 30 different types of firearms that could have potentially fired such bullets. The DNA analysis conducted on Jane's pantyhose strongly indicated that Gary Leiterman was the perpetrator. According to a DNA expert, the likelihood of anyone else leaving that specific trace was astonishingly low, with odds of 171.5 trillion to 1. However, Leiterman's defense team had a different strategy in mind. They aimed to discredit the most significant piece of evidence against him, the DNA found on the pantyhose. Their argument revolved around the lack of trustworthiness of the pantyhose as evidence, especially considering that the blood found on Jane's hand belonged to an entirely different individual, a 4-year-old who should not have been present at the crime scene. This raised serious concerns about the accuracy of the laboratory's work and the possibility of errors. During the court proceedings, it was revealed that in 2002, genetic samples from Gary Leiterman, Jane Mixer, and John Rules were all being processed in the same laboratory. Even more surprising, on the same day, an analyst was working on the blood droplet from Jane's hand in 1969. Bloody clothes from Rulis's mother's murder were also being tested. While DNA evidence is typically reliable, this case presented confusion. Prosecutors attempted to explain the presence of the child's DNA by suggesting that Rulis may have witnessed the murder, but there was no evidence linking Leiterman to Rulis. Therefore, the primary question arose. Could the laboratory have accidentally mixed up the DNA samples? Leiterman's defense attorney raised the possibility of lab contamination, which seemed to be a more plausible explanation. They argued that the lab might have unintentionally mixed up the samples, particularly considering the presence of a child's DNA on the hand of the victim. If such a mix-up could occur, it cast doubt on the reliability of the pantyhose DNA as well. This significantly undermined the prosecution's key evidence. The prosecution did not back down easily. They presented witnesses who detailed the extensive precautions taken by the lab to prevent errors and keep evidence separate. Supervisor Jeffrey Nye testified that there were no mix-ups. Surprisingly, Leiterman opted not to defend himself in court. After a 2-week trial and just a few hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Leiterman was convicted of first-degree murder. Jane's father, Dan Mixer, broke down in tears, while her sister Barbara described feeling numb. In a memoir about the trial, Maggie Nelson expressed lingering doubts about the true identity of the killer. The verdict had a profound impact on Leiterman and his family. During his sentencing, Leiterman finally spoke in court, expressing regret for the Mixer's loss and maintaining his innocence. Despite his plea, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Leiterman continued to fight for his innocence through appeals and support from believers, but a new trial was never granted. He passed away in prison in 2019 at the age of 74. While the case is closed, doubts and questions remain, leaving Jane Mixer's murder unresolved for many. On April 29, 2017, Lyon County deputies were called to investigate the discovery of a skull in the 2000 block of Road 145 in Neosho Rapids, Kansas. The skull was found on the west side of the river, near the banks. The person who found it had gone to the river to check the water level after recent rainfall when they noticed the skull. Further investigation led to the discovery of additional remains, including a fitted bed sheet, comforter, and a digital watch, all inside a lawn trash sack. Although the sack was tied at the top, animals had managed to tear into it and access the remains. Lyon County Sheriff's detectives took over the case and conducted an autopsy. The autopsy revealed that the man had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. It was determined that he was middle to late-aged and approximately 5 inches tall. The man's death was estimated to have occurred between 2013 and 2016, but the cause of death remained unknown. In August 2017, the details of the case were entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. Despite extensive efforts, including DNA analysis conducted by the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, the identity of the deceased remained a mystery. Detective Sergeant Travis Mitchell of the Lyon County Sheriff's Office and his team worked tirelessly over the years to identify the Neosho Rapids John Doe. In 2022, Lyon County deputies partnered with Othram, a forensic laboratory, which provided new leads for the investigation. In March 2024, Lyon County detectives contacted a potential relative of the unknown man, leading to the identification of the deceased as Randy Bruce Clayton. Randy was born on October 12, 1953, and was originally from the Phoenix, Arizona area, but had been living in Oklahoma. Surprisingly, Randy had never been reported missing. Colby L., Othram's director of operations, emphasized the significance of maintaining hope. He highlighted the accessibility of technology to aid in resolving cases like this one, pointing out that the primary obstacle currently is funding, which is gradually improving. Colby stressed the importance of advocacy for those who are unable to provide financial support. He emphasized the value of advocating for innovative technologies to assist in bringing closure to such cases. The investigation into Randy's case remains ongoing,